Today we're going to be talking about the 4 principles of experimental design. Before we can talk about well-designed experiments, we're going to talk about poorly designed experiments. Read along with me. Are online SAT prep courses effective? A bad experiment. A high school regularly offers a review course to prep students for the SAT. This year, budget cuts will allow the school to offer only an online version of the course. Suppose the groups of students who take the online course earn an average increase of 45 points in their math scores from a pre-test to the actual SAT test. Can we conclude that the online course is effective? This experiment has a very simple design. A group of subjects, the students, were exposed to a treatment, the online course, and the outcome, the increase in math scores, was observed or measured. Here's the design in this graphic below. A closer look showed that many of the students in the online review course were taking advanced math classes in high school. Maybe the students in the online course improved their math scores because of what they were learning in their school math classes, not because of the online course. This confounding prevents us from concluding that the online course is effective. And just to review, this is considered confounding, this enrollment in advanced math classes in high school. This is confounding because it's an additional variable that could be impacting our response variable. It could be impacting the students' math scores. And so we can't separate whether the increase in math scores is actually due to the online course or is due to the students' enrollment in advanced math classes. So in the lab, or in a really controlled setting, many experiments use a design like this SAT example, where we have experimental units that take a treatment and then we measure the response. And this is okay in a lab where the setting is very, very specific and very controlled, but in the real world, in a field experiment, that's what we call experiments in the real world, the conditions are more variable, and these types of experiments that are poorly designed often yield worthless results because of confounding. So how do we prevent confounding? The easiest way to prevent confounding is actually the first one of our principles of experimental design, and that is the idea of comparison. And comparison, or comparative experiment, is an experiment in which we compare two different treatments. So in this particular example, a comparative experiment would be where some students are taught the SAT course in a classroom and other similar students take the course online. Most well-designed experiments compare 2 or more treatments because it gives us good evidence that the differences in treatments actually cause the differences we see in the response variable. So in this case, the differences in the type of SAT course that you are taking online or in a classroom actually cause the differences in the response variable, which is your SAT math score. So comparison is great, but it's actually not enough if our groups don't look the same to begin with. If we have 2 different groups of students that are very different to begin with, then our results are going to be biased. So, for instance, in this case, if we allowed students to select an online or a classroom instruction for their SAT preparation, the more self-motivated students would likely sign up for the online course. So this personal choice, right, this voluntary enrollment in an online course is a type of bias that would make our results harder to trust. So to prevent bias, we use chance to assign experimental units or students to different treatments. This prevents bias because it creates roughly equivalent groups of experimental units by balancing out the effects of other variables among treatment groups. So now, rather than just having the self-motivated students in the online class because they selected to be in there, those highly motivated students are going to be balanced out among the 2 groups because we're using a chance process. When treatments are randomly assigned in an experiment, right, so when students are randomly put in an online SAT prep course or an in-person class, the only systematic difference between the 2 groups should be the treatment assigned. There is going to be some variation between the 2 groups, but that is just occurring by chance. That is not occurring because of any design in our experiment. You're now going to watch a video from the textbook publisher that's going to explain to you how we can randomly assign individuals or subjects to treatments. This is going to look very familiar to you because it uses the same chance processes, the HAT method and random number generator and table D, to place subjects into treatments. Previously, we used these to place individuals in a population into the sample. Now we're going to use them in an experiment.
This is Jason Molesky. In this example, we'll take a look at how random assignment works in an experimental design. This year, the high school has enough budget money to compare the online SAT course with traditional classroom instruction. 50 students have agreed to participate in an experiment comparing two instructional methods. Our problem is to describe how we randomly assign 25 students to each of the two methods, online or traditional. We'll want to take a look at how we do it using 50 identical slips of paper, how we do it using technology, and how we do it using Table D. Perhaps the simplest way to go about assigning these treatments is to use the HAT method. So what we could do is write each subject's name down on one of the slips of paper, put all those slips in a hat, mix them thoroughly. Then we could draw them out one at a time until we have 25 slips. Those 25 students would take the online course, while the remaining 25 students would take the classroom course. Alternatively, we could write online on 25 slips and classroom on the other 25 slips, then put those paper in a hat and mix them well. We could have students come up one by one and, without looking, pick a slip from the hat. This guarantees 25 students per group with the treatments assigned by chance. We could also use technology to assign our treatments. So we could give numbers 1, 2, 3, and so on all the way up to 50 to the subjects in alphabetical order by last name. Then we could use our calculator's rand-int command or a computer's random number generator to produce numbers between 1 and 50. The first 25 different or unique numbers that are chosen would select the students for the online course. Remember, we have to ignore repeats when they come up. The remaining 25 subjects would take the classroom course. Finally, we could assign this using Table D. We could use the two-step process from random sampling to do the random assignment. So to do this, we'd have to start by labeling all of the individuals in the class. Since we're using a random digit table, we'd have to give 2-digit labels to each individual. 01, 02, 03, and so on up to 50. Then we'd randomize. We could go to a line of Table D and read 2-digit groups moving from left to right across the row. The first 25 distinct labels between 0 and 50 that we encounter would select the online group. Remember, we have to ignore repeats, and we'd also have to ignore any numbers that fall outside of the 0, 1 to 50 range. Finally, the remaining 25 students would take the classroom course. Like I said, we'd ignore repeated labels and groups of digits from 51 to 00. Now, for some additional practice on how random assignment works in experimental design, try exercise 59.
The third principle of experimental design that I want to talk about is control, which many of you have heard about before. And the idea of control is that we are going to keep other variables that might affect the response the same for all of the groups. So let me give you an example. Suppose we use 2 different instructors for the SAT experiment. If we have Mr. Yule-Larson teaching the online group and Ms. Madoff teaching the classroom group, then course type will be confounded with instructor. What that means is we don't know if the difference in average improvement for the 2 groups was due to the difference in the instructor or due to the difference in the type of course, right? So we would have the same instructor. We would use Mr. Yule-Larson for both courses to make sure that there were no confounding variables. In addition, control helps us reduce variability in our results, which makes it easy to see which treatment is more effective. Finally, the fourth principle of experimental design is the idea of replication. You've heard the term replication in other areas in your life, potentially maybe in biology last year, but in statistics, replication means we need to use enough subjects in our treatments to ensure that the results, the effects of the treatments can be distinguished from chance differences in the groups. So what does this mean? So let's say we did this SAT experiment with only 6 subjects. 2 of which were in an advanced math class. There's a 50% chance that these 2 subjects will end up in the same treatment group, right? Which would make our results look very, very different from if those higher level math, those advanced students were spread out between our groups. However, if we had 60 students in the experiment and 20 of them were in an advanced math class, there's almost no chance that they would end up in the same treatment group. So the more replication that we have, the more balanced the treatment groups will be after random assignment. So the last thing that you're going to watch now is an example of a well-designed experiment and how each of these 4 principles of experimental design function in a well-designed experiment. Make sure that you are carefully noting how each of these 4 apply so that you're ready for your online pre-learn check.
Hi, this is Jason Molesky. In this example, we'll see what a well-designed experiment looks like. Does regularly taking aspirin help protect people against heart attacks? The Physicians' Health Study was a medical experiment that helped answer that question. In fact, this study looked at the effects of 2 drugs, aspirin and beta-carotene. Researchers wondered whether beta-carotene would help prevent some forms of cancer. Now, the subjects in this experiment were 21,996 male physicians. There were 2 explanatory variables, or factors, each having 2 levels, aspirin, yes or no, and beta-carotene, yes or no. Now, these different levels are laid out in this particular chart. 1/4 of the subjects were assigned at random to each of these treatments. And on odd-numbered days, the subjects took either a tablet that contained aspirin or a dummy pill that looked and tasted like the aspirin but had no active ingredient, a placebo. On even-numbered days, they took either a capsule containing beta-carotene or a placebo. Now, there were several response variables. The study looked for heart attacks, several kinds of cancer, and other medical outcomes. After several years, 239 of the placebo group, but only 139 of the aspirin group, had suffered heart attacks. This difference is large enough to give good evidence that taking aspirin does reduce heart attacks. It did not appear, however, that beta-carotene had any effect on preventing cancer. Now let's explain how each of the 4 principles of experimental design was used in this study. Now you'll recall the 4 different principles are comparison, random assignment, control, and replication. For comparison, we note that researchers used a design that compared both of the active treatments to a placebo. For random assignment, we note this was used to determine which subjects received each of the 4 treatment combinations. This helped ensure that the treatment groups were roughly equivalent to begin with. The experiment used subjects of the same gender and occupation, and all subjects followed the same schedule of pill taking, so this experiment does have an element of control. And for replication, there were over 5,000 subjects per treatment group. This large number of subjects helped ensure that the difference in heart attacks was due to the aspirin and not due to chance variation in the random assignment. For some additional practice in identifying well-designed experiments, try exercise 63.
Those are all the 4 principles of experimental design. Please write down any questions that you have so that you can ask them in class this week.